scientific interests are invertebrate zoology and ecology. Dr. Holmberg joined Athabasca University when it was in Edmonton in 1974, moved to Athabasca when the university moved here, and then retired in 2008 in Athabasca. He's taught ecology and other courses for more than 30 years for the university. Dr. Holmberg is a founding member of Science Outreach Athabasca and has always been a strong advocate of university involvement in science outreach. He's given more than 300 presentations in 22 schools and organizations, which cover 12 Alberta communities. He's given around a dozen public talks for Science Outreach Athabasca, and we're really excited to have him here today to talk to us about crustaceans.
Okay, thanks, Carmen, and welcome everybody. This is I think our 20th year of Science Outreach Athabasca, and hopefully we'll do another 20 years. But anyways, tonight is crustaceans, and I'm going to be showing the slides, but also at the video of myself, I'm going to show some specimens occasionally. So if you look at my picture once in a while, we will see those things. Okay, the first thing I wanted to remind people is we live in quite a wondrous world. We forget that at times, but this world that we live in, we actually know very little about, and hopefully tonight you'll see some of the things that we don't know things about. Okay, so for the outline of the talk, we're going to talk about what is a crustacean. Then we're going to deal with how numerous are crustaceans and in their different habitats. And the big part of the talk will be on an overview of the most important crustacean groups and the interesting crustacean groups. And then at the end, we'll talk about the importance of crustaceans in general. So what is a crustacean? Well, first of all, it's an animal, and it is an arthropod. So right away we have to say, well, what in the world is an arthropod? Well, these animals on the right-hand side of the screen are all arthropods. So the top left is an extinct group of the trilobites. Another extinct group to the right are the eurypterids. And then down we have the arachnid group with the scorpions and mites and things like, and spiders, things like that. And then the next one is the crustaceans that we're talking about tonight. And then the myriapods, which are the centipedes and millipedes, and then the very big group called the insects. Now, whoops, I went backwards. So you can see from these pictures, they're bilaterally symmetrical. They have a segmented body and appendages, but what is quite different is that they have a cuticle which forms an exoskeleton. Now, in a crustacean, this is what the cuticle looks like. For all arthropods, there's a single layer of epidermal cells that secrete the cuticle, and then you can see that in order to get their sense organs or any secretions, they have to go through the cuticle. And so the cuticles in various subsections, but we won't go into that. But one of the things about crustacean exoskeletons or cuticle is that they usually do not have a waxy layer, as a lot of insects do, and so they're not resistant to desiccation. So if you have an exoskeleton, the question a lot of people think about is, how do you possibly grow? And it's sort of like being in a suit of armor and you eat a big meal. There's no way for it to expand, but crustaceans grow by a process of shedding the exoskeleton. This is called molting or ecdysis. And there's a diagram here of how the either a lobster or crayfish goes through the molting process. And so there's a split along the back, usually between the thorax and abdomen, and then the animal slowly crawls out of the old exoskeleton with a new exoskeleton forming underneath of it. And the old exoskeleton the muscles have to detach from the old one and reattach to the new one. And their sense organs during this molting process are inhibited. Their breathing is inhibited. it's a very difficult process. And when they're finished, like in 5, they're about the same size as when they started. And then they increase their blood pressure in various parts of their body and expand the soft new exoskeleton until it hardens, and that's how they get bigger. And this is a very dangerous process because they're susceptible to predation and as well as desiccation and things going wrong. And for an example, 10 to 15% of lobsters die during molting. Okay, this is a body plan of general body plan of crustaceans. So they have a head, thorax, and abdomen. And when you're eating lobster tail or shrimp tails, you're really eating the abdomen. And when you talk about deveining shrimp, you're actually talking about removing the intestine, because the anus ends up just at this area here before the telson, and so the intestine goes along into the thorax. Now, the head thorax, the head part has a couple of pairs of antennae, and 2 pairs of antennae are typical of crustaceans. Some of them only have 1 pair, but usually they have 2. Then they have their eyes, which may be compound or fairly simple, and then they have 3 pairs of mouth parts. And then the thorax has 0 to 2 pairs of mouth parts, and that's where, if they have legs, that's where the legs are. And the head thorax can be fused together and covered with a carapace that protects it, that goes together. Then you have the abdomen, which have pleopods or appendages of various kinds, and the telson, as I say, is the final part. And a lot of crustaceans, the abdomen is vestigial or actually absent. Okay, the other big thing about crustaceans is they have a 2-branched appendage system, or a birema system. And the inner one is usually dealing with gills for breathing, and then the outer one is used for walking or locomotion in some way or another. And then a third distinguishing feature of crustaceans is the Nauplius larvae. And this is what it looks like. And it's quite common in crustaceans, but again, not all crustaceans have this larval stage. And it's got 3 pairs of appendages. They're all cephalic, or from the head, and they have a medial simple eye, and that, as I say, is typical. So now, how numerous are crustaceans? Well, if we look at this diagram, on the right-hand side, you can see there's insects. The darker circle is a indication of how many species have been described, and the lighter circle surrounding it, the larger one, is an estimate of how many there actually are in the world. And you see insects dominate everything. And then the second biggest group on the lower left-hand side are the arachnids or chelicerates. So again, the scorpions and the daddy longlegs, the spiders and the mites. And then the next biggest group above that are the mollusks. So that's the snails and the clams and the cephalopods of various kinds. And then the 4th group is the crustaceans that we're dealing with tonight. Now, I've taken and blown up some of the statistics because it's pretty small. They're pretty small on this diagram. So the crustaceans have about 47,000 species described, and that's less than 1/3 of what's estimated to be out there. Versus the mammals, where about 5,000 species are described, and there's a couple of bats and rodents that haven't been described, and they're just about well, probably in the next couple of decades, the mammals will be described 100%. Okay, where do crustaceans live? Well, they're mostly marine, and there's lots of them in freshwater ecosystems. And if you've ever eaten a predatory fish like a pike or a walleye, you've indirectly eaten a crustacean. And then there's a few terrestrial crustaceans. Not too many, but there are a few. Now, if you take a fine mesh net and tow it behind a boat in the ocean. This is what you get if you eliminate the plastic, because these days there's little bits of plastic that are floating throughout the ocean. It's estimated that 10% of all the plastic produced in the world ends up in the oceans. And so this doesn't have any plastic in it. But you can see there's a whole range of organisms that you would find in this plankton toe. And I've taken and I've circled all of the crustaceans. And you can see that there's a lot of crustaceans in the plankton layer of the ocean. So if we look at the total picture in the ocean, the mollusks still have more species because the plankton toe doesn't include the benthic or the bottom regions of the ocean. So there's more mollusks in the ocean than there are crustaceans, but they're the second largest group. And then you can see that there's the fishes and the sponges and the cnidarians, the jellyfish and corals and things like that. So if you take a plankton toe in freshwater, you get less diversity. And I've circled again the crustaceans in this particular plankton toe. Now in freshwater systems, insects predominate in terms of speciation, in terms of numbers, in terms of biomass, but crustaceans are important, especially in the plankton area. And plankton, by the way, if you've forgotten, or organisms may be able to have mobility, but the mobility is overwhelmed by wave action and current action. So terrestrial crustaceans, there's a few. There's at the top, there's some amphipods, there are some land-dwelling crabs, and then there's the best of the crustaceans for the terrestrial life, and that's the sowbugs or woodlice. Now, this is an overview of the crustaceans of Alberta, and these numbers are derived from this book by Clifford. Now, this is now 30 years old, so the names have changed quite a bit. But the big thing I wanted to get from this is the bottom figure that he estimated there were over 140 species. The true number is probably over 200 species. And the big groups, again, are the cladocerans or water fleas, the copepods, and the ostracods or seed shrimp. Now, we'll go over these again, sort of line by line as we go through the other crustacean groups. But this is what Alberta is like. It's a landlocked piece of land, so we're not connected to the ocean, and we don't have that many crustaceans. Now, crustaceans, because they have this hard exoskeleton, have a fairly good fossil group. They go back to the well over 56 million years ago, but I'm not going to look at the fossil groups at all. Okay, so now we move on to the third part. We're going to look at the various crustacean groups, and don't worry about these technical names. We'll go through them, but we'll go through those piece by piece, and you'll see them. But the decapods at the very end will be expanded because they're a very important group and very diverse. Okay, so the first group we're going to look at is the Remepids or Remepids. They sort of look like an aquatic centipede, but they do have biramous appendages, and they do have 2 pairs of antennae. They've only been found fairly recently, back in 1978, and only 17 species have so far been described. So it's a very small group, and they're found in the subtropics, in deep oceans, and also in caves. And what's neat about them is that they're the only venomous crustaceans that they're in existence. And the other thing is that they're more closely related to insects than most of the other crustaceans. So maybe in the future they'll be farmed out as a separate group from the crustaceans. But because of their biramous appendages and 2 pairs of antennae, they're stuck into the crustaceans right now. Okay, the next group are the brachiopods, and brachiopods refers to gill feet because they breathe with their feet. They also move with their feet because they swim, and they also feed with their feet. And again, if you look closely at this diagram, there's the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. They're called fairy shrimp, and in Alberta we've got 13 species of them, mostly found in small ponds rather than in lakes and early in the spring. So here's some photographs of them. The males have their antennae modified for grasping the females, and the females will carry a single egg sac at the back of their thorax. Now, fairy shrimp are not found in the oceans, but there's one group of the fairy shrimp, often called the brine shrimp, and Artemia is one of the genera that does this, and they're found in brackish waters. So this is an aerial photograph around the San Francisco Bay Area, and they're raising brine shrimp or commercially for fish food. And they use the eggs primarily, and they freeze dry them. And some young kids will have seen, I remember when I was a kid, there were in comic book advertisements, you could buy sea monkeys. And that's what sea monkeys are brine shrimp. Okay, the next group of the brachiopods we're going to look at are the tadpole shrimp, and that's what these things look like. They haven't changed in their external appearance since the Carboniferous period. So they've been around a long time. And we've got two species in Alberta looking mostly like the one on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Then the next group of brachiopods are the clam shrimp, and they look like little clams. And this photograph is in the palm of somebody's hand, showing what they look like. And they're fairly large in that they're 1 or 2 centimeters, and these are only found in fresh water. And this is what they look like if you dissect them. They have large antennae that they use for movement. They have an adductor muscle for taking the carapace and pulling it together. And we've got 3 species in the province. So the next group of brachiopods are the cladocerans or water fleas, and Daphnia is one of the genera of cladocerans, and a lot of people have heard of Daphnia. So here's a photograph of Daphnia, a big eye, the antennae that are used for locomotion as well as for feeding. This is the gut, so the mouth region is in this area, and the end is up in the anus back in here. And then this part over in the dorsal part are eggs. There's a few of the brachiopods, all of them are freshwater, except in this group, there are a few marine forms. So this is another picture of a cladoceran, and some of them give live birth. So the eggs, instead of going through various larval stages, the mothers can give birth to small cladocerans directly, and they can do this asexually on occasion. And in Alberta, we've got over 39 species, so it's a big group. Daphnia is part of it, but there's a number of other genera. So this is another photograph of a cladoceran, and the arrow indicates some light green things that are difficult to distinguish from the yellow, but they're bits of plastic. And all of the crustaceans tend to filter feed, taking small particles out of the water to feed on, and they really can't distinguish by taste, but just by size. So they're starting to pick up these small pieces of plastic, and this is problematic because it gets into the food chain, and we don't know the ramifications because the plastics are giving off byproducts and may be quite toxic. So we next move into the third group, the Remepids, which are the barnacles. And usually the barnacles that we think about are the sessile ones. And if and this is the size of most of these ones. They're quite small, but some of them are, oops, that's better, are fairly large. So they come in different sizes. Okay, all the barnacles are marine, and they're all filter feeders. And some of them are stalked, like this one. So they have a fleshy stalk to adhere to the substrate rather than directly on with the calciferous plates. And these are called goose or gooseneck barnacles. And some of these gooseneck barnacles are a delicacy in Spain and Portugal. And it used to be that Canada would export to Spain and Portugal a similar species, but because of over collection, that has now stopped. Okay, this is a picture of Charles Darwin when he was, 7 years old? Yeah, he was 7 years old. And he started studying barnacles in 1846, and for the next 8 or 9 years or so, he studied barnacles, and he had barnacles all over his house, because in those days, any naturalist or biologist would be working at home. They wouldn't have a laboratory separate from at home. And why I put the picture of him as a young child was because one of his sons grew up amongst barnacles, and when he visited his friend, he remarked he was wondering where his friend's father's barnacles were, because he expected everyone to have barnacles in their house. Okay, this is the life cycle of barnacles. So you can see in the top right-hand corner is the Nauplius Larvae, which goes into another form of larvae, and then it goes upside down, rests its head, and its first or second pair of antennae forms a foot-like object, cements itself to a surface, and then it feeds as a filter feeder. And these are the Remepids that they use to take particles out of the water for them. Now, because they're sessile, and some of them are indeed have separate sexes, they have a problem of the males reaching the females. Now, some barnacles will shed sperm into the water column, and then the females pick it up that way. But some of them have a very elongate penis, and they have the longest penis with respect to their body size in the world. Another thing you can talk about to your friends when you have nothing else to talk about. Okay, now barnacles will cause fouling of piers and boats and things, and the arrow points to the row of barnacles. Below them, the black ones are barnacles as well as mussels. And this fouling will increase drag of ship hulls, and increased drag causes increased fuel costs. And it's estimated that for a typical cruise ship such as this one, it would cost $500,000 a year for fuel if they didn't remove the barnacles or treat the hulls to prevent barnacle adhesion. So they usually adhere to rocks and wood, but they also adhere to animals such as this whale. Now there's another group of barnacles that are parasitic, and this is a view of the underside of a crab, and the yellow part that has been circled and enlarged is a barnacle. And a really strange looking barnacle. Here's a diagram of what the barnacle is. It's basically a sack of eggs and some tentacle-like process that go into the crab to obtain nourishment. So it's a parasite. There's another group of parasites. We're moving on to the maxillopods, and that's the fish lice. And they're external parasites of fish and a few other animals. Here's another photograph of them. They're fairly flattened and have little hooks-like devices to latch onto their prey. And we've got one species in the province. So the next group we're looking at are the copepods, and that equals orpheet, just like the Remepids. There's another, they must have, the Greeks had two different names for oars. But this is what a typical copepod looks like. Uses its antenna for swimming. Usually the females produce a dual egg sac. They have a single medial eye, and this is in this particular specimen is in the genus Cyclops, after the Greek mythical monster with one eye. So these are also filter feeder planktonic organisms. And in Alberta, we've got over 49 species. So it's a big group in the freshwater ecosystems. So this is a diagram of various marine copepods, and you can see they're form many different forms. The bottom's right-hand ones are parasitic, but most of them are free-living, and some of them can be quite fanciful. But some of them are, as I say, are parasitic, and this is a close-up photograph of a dorsal fin of a shark, and the arrow points to the copepod, which is really been reduced in a lot of its forms. And this is a diagram of a flying fish that's been attacked by copepods that the arrow points to in red, but the copepod parasites are parasitized by some barnacles indicated in blue. So they're hypoparasites. This poor flying fish has got a lot of drag to resist. So the next group are the ostracods, or the seed shrimp, and these are quite small planktonic feeders. 1 or 2 millimeters is their typical size. They're not very big, and they have this carapace that goes over like a clam shell, like in the clam shrimp. But they're considerably smaller, and they don't have the ridges on the carapace as the other ones do. And this is what they look like when they're not disturbed. The carapace expands out to the side, and that's how they go through and filter feed. And when they're under duress of some description or worried about predation, they close the carapace. And this is what they look like inside, and we've got over 23 species in the province. So they're also quite numerous. Now we're moving to the melicostrans, and they're a very large group of the crustaceans, very diverse in their form. This set of this collage of melicostrans is from Wikipedia. You can see all kinds of body shapes. So the first group we're going to look at are the Mantis Shrimp, and this particular one, I believe, is a peacock Mantis Shrimp, very colorful, and fairly large. This is showing the carapace doesn't go all the way across the thorax. It ends a couple of segments before the end of the thorax. And they're all predators. They're all marine, and they are formed into two groups. There's the spearers and the smashers. And I'm going to show you a plastic model of one of the spearers. You can see this raptorial appendage would spike into its prey, and it would pull it into its mouth for feeding. And this size is fairly large. A lot of them are quite a bit smaller than this, but this is what they look like. Okay. So here's a picture of one of those that uses a hammer. It's a maxilla for smashing open a snail, a molluscan snail shell. So besides the physical force, the the appendage moves so quickly through the water column that it creates small bubbles of gaseous bubbles within the water, and they cavitate or implode. And when they implode, they produce heat, sound, and light. And we'll go into this in another group a little bit more detail. But they sort of give a double whammy to their prey, because it's not only the mechanical force, but it's the shock wave that is produced against their prey. And mantis shrimp also have very, very complex eyes, the most complex eyes in the whole animal kingdom. The compound eyes are divided into 3 different parts, and they can see in different divisions and at different wavelengths all at the same time. And they have 12 to 16 types of photoreceptors compared to us, which we have 4, 3 for color and 1 for black and white. So they're very, very complex eyes. Now, the next group of the malacostrans, we're looking at the true malacostrans, are the mysids or the possum shrimp, and an example is krill. A lot of people have heard of krill because they're so numerous that in the Antarctic oceans, that's what the whales are feeding on. The baleen whales are feeding on predominantly. We have 1 mysid in the province, and that's this species. It's changed from the name has changed from Clifford's book, but that's what it looks like. And the next group we're going to look at are the amphipods, sometimes called side swimmers or scuds. And amphi are different feet, so they each of the legs tend to differ from one another. And we've got 5 species in the province. Now, if you look at ponds with amphipods in the spring and summer, you'll often see them with this red dot, and that red dot is actually the cyst of a tapeworm. And this tapeworm changes the behavior of the amphipod. Instead of going to the bottom of the pond and staying motionless to hide from predators, it comes to the surface and moves about quite readily, so that they're obvious, and the red spot attracts things like birds, which eat them, and then the life cycle of the tapeworm continues. Here's another amphipod that's quite interesting. This one will take out the insides of a salp. A salp is a barrel-shaped planktonic tunicate. It's not quite a vertebrate, but it's in the urochordates. And then it lives inside of the shell of its host, and it will lay its eggs and feed and do everything else, and has the part of its old host as protection. Now we're moving to the isopods, the equal feet organisms, and this is another collage from Wikipedia that shows the diversity of them. They're mostly marine, but they can be fat, skinny, flattened, with all kinds of spines and processes out of their bodies, a very large group of organisms. And some of the deep sea ones are quite big, as you can see with this person holding one in 2 hands. And some of these are external parasites, as shown with this one. They feed on the scales and the mucus and perhaps some of the blood of their host. And they're mostly fish, but there's other things as well that they feed on. And sometimes they become internal parasites. So the lower right picture shows the isopod in the mouth of a fish, and the upper picture shows a dissection of the side of a fish's face, taking away the operculum and showing the isopod. And this isopod crawls into the fish's mouth, eats out its tongue, and then sits in the place of the tongue and gets the first dibs on any meals that the fish goes after. And this is another isopod. We have one aquatic species that looks very similar to this. It only is found in caves in the eastern Rockies, and is blind and probably less pigmented than this particular species. And that's the species that's in Alberta. And then the last group of the isopods we're looking at are the wood lice or the sowbugs. And we have at least one species, probably 2 or 3 species. Montana has 4, and officially the prairie provinces have 0 isopods because nobody has collected them and identified them properly and reported them in the scientific literature. But lots of people have seen them in the prairie provinces. They're all imported from Europe. None of them are native to Canada. Well, Western Canada. Eastern Canada, there might be 1 or 2 species that are native. Now we move on to the decapods, those crustaceans that have 10 feet. And they're also a large group within the large group. And they tend to be larger crustaceans, and they also tend to be the crustaceans that we eat. Okay, the first group we're going to look at are prawns, and prawns to most people are just big shrimp. Well, in scientific areas, we like putting restricting common names to particular groups. And as you find in this presentation, the word crab, shrimp, and lobster are used in many different contexts. So there are true shrimp and true lobsters and true prawns, as opposed to using an adjective or a noun in apposition to describe another group. So prawns are fairly large shrimp-like things, and here is a plastic model of a prawn. So you can see they're quite large, as opposed to some of the shrimp that are shrimp-like, small. Lots of species and a bunch of different families, so they're not a uniform group, whatever, and lots of species are fished or farmed. And then we move into the shrimp, and this is a Carderian shrimp. Again, lots of different species and lots of different families, and again, lots of them are fished and farmed. Now, the shrimp industry is quite important to a lot of countries, but not so much in Canada. But there's about 300 species, less than 300 species that are of economic importance, but only 6 species dominate the global catch. And in Canada, it's relatively small industry because we don't have the warm waters that most the shrimp and prawns require. Okay, the next group we're going to look at are the coral shrimp, and these are often live in crevices in subtropical areas, and they're brightly colored because they clean parasites off of fish and other animals, and they advertise themselves, and they don't tend to be eaten, and they're commensal with those. And there's another group of these Carderian shrimp, and some of them are transparent, like this one on a postcard from Indonesia, and some of them are cleaner shrimp and clean off external parasites as the other ones. So this symbiosis of cleaning off the fish is been evolved a few different times. Okay, next we move into the snapping or the pistol shrimp, and they have one of their first pair of legs modified into this large organ that snaps quite quickly. So in less than a millisecond, it closes, and it also produces cavitation bubbles in the water with up to 80 kilopascals of energy, which I don't really know what that means, but I do know that 248 decibels at 4 centimeters, that's twice what a chainsaw would create at a greater distance. And it has a temperature of 4,500 degrees Celsius plus light. So again, they have this double whammy effect, and they use it to stun their prey, and they also use it for defending their territories. Now we move on to the true lobsters. And this is 2 different photographs of the same sculpture in New Brunswick of Homarus americanus, the American lobster. And one of the things you'll notice about lobsters is the first 3 pairs of legs are chelate or pincher-like. The first one is very enlarged, but the second and third ones are quite smaller. But if you look closely, you'll see that they have these little movable fingers that they can pinch things with. And they use their pleopods in the abdomen to form a pseudopenis for sperm transfer. And my prediction is the next time you eat lobster and you look and to see if it's a male or a female, it'll be a male, because Oceans and Fisheries Canada has sexual bias against males. Okay, lobsters come in many different colors. There's 50 different mutations. They're normally brown or green or combination thereof, but blue, yellow, red, orange, white, etc. There's a whole pile of them. They're fairly rare, like one in 1 million lobsters, or 1 in 10 million, or something like that. And here's one mutation that is quite strange. Is a bilateral mutation, with this one side being black, brownish green, and the other side being reddish orange. This is just my favorite dish. Okay, so lobster fisheries are economically important. $1.46 billion for Atlantic Canada in 2017. It's a really big industry for Atlantic Canada. And lobsters can go up to 20 kilograms, and they are the largest arthropod in the world when they reach that. Now, most lobsters are quite a bit smaller than that. This model is a little bit smaller than you would take commercially, but it's a fairly good size. Be a couple of well, probably 3 or 4 years old to reach even this size. Okay, now. Okay, lobster tracks, we found out, are quite inefficient. That only 10%, less than 10% of the lobsters that come into a trap, into this part in here and into this funnel, and then go into holding container here, which has a bait of dead fish or something like that. But of these, only about 6% are caught, because most of them escape from where they've come from. And you might think, well, we should improve the efficiency of these traps, but if we do, we'd have to reduce the quota that the fisher folk take, and of course that would cause all kinds of political ramifications. Okay, now we move on to the crayfish, and I give you here a whole pile of different names that are used locally in the English language for crayfish. I like mud bugs and yabbies, which I'd never thought, when hearing those, I didn't know what they were referring to. This is one of the problems with common local names, is that it doesn't indicate much to someone from outside the area. You don't know what they're talking about. Now, crayfish, just like lobsters, have modified pleopods for sperm transfer, as shown in this male crayfish, and the female pleopods are used for holding their eggs. And crayfish also hold their eggs, and on the embryonic stages go through in the egg stage, and they come out as looking like small crayfish. And there's one species in Alberta, this is it. They're normally found in the Beaver River system, but these were taken at Whitecourt, and so they're now in the Athabasca River Basin. So somebody somewhere has moved them, and they've adapted and are proliferating. Okay, the economic importance, like this blue one, they're used in the aquarium pet trade as pets, but they're also a great numbers of them are used in food. So if you ever go down to Louisiana, crawdads are something you'd want to try. Okay, now we move on to the spiny lobsters. They can be quite large, as shown in this picture on the right-hand side, and there's a sculpture of spiny lobster in Bali. And these have massive antennae that they use in territorial defense. And in this family, there's about 60 species. So there's quite a few spiny lobsters. And then there's a slipper lobsters, and they come in different species as well. And they have these very large flattened antennae. And that's what is distinctive of them. And then we come to these Yeti crabs or Yeti lobsters. So they sort of look like crabs and they sort of look like lobsters. And it's a fairly new group. It was only discovered in 2005 when we got submersibles to go down. There's only 6 species that have been in process or have been described. And it's only, as I say, they're new because people have been going down now to deep sea hydrothermal vents and cold seeps and finding these specimens. And they all have these hairs or spines that are extensions on their appendages and their bodies, and they're found with symbiotic bacteria. And what is thought happens is they hold these over the vents, and the sulfurous and methane type of gases that are coming out of these vents are feeding the bacteria, and then they scrape the bacteria off and feed on that. And here's a picture of a vent, and the white parts, if you look closely, are barnacles, and the sort of cream colors are these Yeti crabs or Yeti lobsters. So they can be quite numerous along these vents, but you don't see them in other places. Now we move on to the hermit crabs. And there are a whole range of hermit crabs. Their specialty is that they use mollusk snail shells for protection. And they will move into a snail shell when they're young, and then when they grow a bit bigger and the snail shell becomes too small, they will exchange the shell for a larger shell. And that's how they go. And they're quite common in the aquarium pet trade, the marine part, and there's also some terrestrial ones that you can buy in pet stores. So this is what they look like when they're semi-exposed. This one is quite small, I would say about 4 centimeters when I took this photograph, and it's in a snail shell that's broken along this the edges of it. And then if you disturb it, it withdraws. It's not quite completely bilaterally symmetrical, and 2 of its appendages close up, and they're very well protected from predators. Now, if you remove one from its snail shell, you can see that the abdomen is very soft and unsegmented and spiral, and it would go into the snail shell. And so these animals are mostly marine, and when in the marine situation, their shells become encrusted with sponges and other growths, so they're quite well camouflaged, but some of them will actually select certain sea anemones and attach them to their shells and get protected from the stinging cells of the anemones. This is a photograph of terrestrial hermit crabs. All of these snail shells, which are a couple of centimeters across, are inhabited by hermit crabs. So they can be quite numerous. And they have a modification of their breathing apparatus for getting oxygen out of the air rather than out of water. Now, one of the things that's happening with hermit crabs is because of plastic trash and tin cans that are being dumped on the ocean or on the beaches, these hermit crabs are starting to move into this these man-made objects for instead of natural shells. And because these things are again releasing, the plastics are releasing toxic chemicals, we're not sure what's going to happen with them in the future. Now, this is a painting of a coconut crab. It's the largest hermit crab in the world, and when it's near adulthood, it abandons shells because it can't find them any bigger than itself, and so they can reach over 4 kilograms, and so they are the largest terrestrial arthropod in the world. And this is one on a garbage can, and you can see they are big critters, and they are eaten, so they are becoming endangered because they taste not bad. So now we move on to the true crabs, and true crabs, there's again lots of them. this is one I took a photograph of in Vancouver. The white things on top of it are barnacles, but this is what crabs look like. And what's neat about them is that their first pair of legs are chelate only, the pincher-like things, and the rest, the other 4 pairs are not. And half of the decapods approximately are true crabs. And this is again a plastic model of one. This is the size that you would find that people would readily eat because they're big enough. You don't tend to eat the part of the body, but you eat the muscles that are in the legs. Okay, to tell a male from a female crab is that male crabs have a narrow abdomen pointed, and the female crabs have a wider, more rounded abdomen that they use for holding their eggs. So on this Sally Lightfoot crab, you can maybe see that this is a fairly realistic model, and this is a male because of the pointed abdomen. Okay. They come in many different shapes. I just showed you the Sally Lightfoot crab, which is model that is life size. You can see the front appendages are quite small and hidden in the photograph on the top left. Well, if you look at the one on the bottom left, the first pair is quite large, and rather than having flattened legs as in the Sally Lightfoot crab, they're rounded. And the one on the top right, the back legs are modified for swimming, and the bottom right it looks like these back legs are meant for burrowing into the substrate. So again, many different shapes and sizes. The arrow crabs on the left-hand side have this big rostrum at the front. The fiddler crabs, the males, have one large claw for signaling females. Then there's the spider crabs that have a fairly small body but long legs, and then you have crabs that are so decorated they're camouflaged on the sea surface. And most decapods and crabs are considered to be scavengers, but some of them are quite predaceous. This is a crab that's feeding on a 2-foot-long snake. And this is a photograph of a Japanese spider crab, and it is the largest arthropod in terms of size on the planet, and its leg span is up to 3 meters across. So a fairly small body, bigger than an average dinner plate, but the legs are again what we go after for protein. And I wanted to show you, talk about the red crabs of Christmas Island. Christmas Island is an Australian territory. It's closer to Indonesia than it is to the continent of Australia, but it's owned by Australia. And they have millions of these red crabs. Now, these red crabs, they migrate. So during the breeding season, they migrate from the inland of the island where it's forested to the ocean, where they mate and lay their eggs, and then the eggs hatch out. They go through a few larval stages, and then they come out as these little tiny crabs. And you can see the carpet of them, and then they migrate back into to the interior of the island and live there. So in the dry season, in the interior of the island, this is what it looks like. This is a buttress tree with, you can see some of the discarded leaves from the trees that are on the ground. But in the wet season, all those leaves disappear because those little red blots are the red crabs that come out of their burrows and feed and scavenge. So you can see they're important decomposers. And these red crabs are so numerous during the migrations to the ocean and from the ocean, they cause disruption. They sometimes will cause a flat tire, and of course, they are a nuisance on the golf course. Okay, crabs. Crabs in Canada are quite important, both on the west coast and the east coast, and together about $1 billion in 2017. So they're quite important commercially. Now we move on to the final portion of the presentation, looking at the ecologic and the economic importance of crustaceans. So first of all, as the fourth largest group of animals, although they're mainly aquatic, they are in all kinds of feeding relationships, and so they're in all kinds of food webs, and they're important in nutrient cycling. And then if we look at ecological importance, the positive part is that they're food for other animals, both aquatic and terrestrial, like this Sally Lightfoot crab has been probably eaten by a bird. And the symbiotic cleaners that we talked about before, and terrestrial species can be important in soil formation. And some of them are good indicators of pollution. The bad part economically is in the shrimp harvesting, there's the bycatch. And in this photograph is the bycatch from shrimp vessel. And it's very hard to see the shrimp amongst all the bycatch of the fish. So there's a lot of, all of these things are thrown back and usually dead. Okay, another negative is that the habitat loss in creating marine and semi-marine situations into fish farms. And then there's the degradation from trawlers that go for getting crabs. And then these shrimp farms will cause pollution because they overfeed them and it gets into the surrounding area, and they have parasite loads that get into the area. And then of course they often raise exotics, just as we raise Atlantic salmon in the Pacific. Some of them escape and become established. Okay, economic importance positive. They feed a lot of our economically important fish. They're food for humans directly, especially the shrimp, lobsters, and crabs. And they're important in the pet trade, both as pets themselves as for food for other pets. And the negative consequences is that they predate on some of the species that we think are important. And they parasitize, especially fish and bivalve mollusks. And they're important when you try and raise them in fish hatcheries and fish pens and shrimp farms. You get parasites of various kinds. The fouling of ship hulls, as we talked about, and these snapping shrimp will cause disruption for communication and sonar. And some isopods are problems in greenhouses. And what did I miss? Oh yeah, some isopods also feed, well, not feed, but burrow into wood pilings and cause collapse of piers. So this group of animals is, I think, quite interesting, and they're quite economically important. And I hope I've stimulated your interest in them and in biology sort of in general. And so if we have any questions, you can put them on the chats, or I can't see from my situation where things are, but Carmen or Linda will be able to get you on. And if you want to contact me, there's my email address. So thank you for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you, Robert. So if you have a question, you can either type it in and I will recite it, or you are free to turn on your microphone and just ask as well. I have a question to start off with. I forget the group of crustacean, but it was one that had a really enlarged claw. And I was just wondering if you have any idea if there's any handedness, like, is it always the right that is big?
No, there's usually a predominance of one side or the other, and occasionally there are some that will switch to the other side. But for the hermit crabs, I'm not sure, because the spiral, well, mollusk snails usually go in one direction in their spiral, but there are some that go in the opposite direction, and I don't know whether they're specialized on that. But if left-handed hermit crab goes into the wrong shell, it would not be able to fit, and vice versa. So on that, I don't know. But I know that in some of the handedness, there are some variations.
How did the animals form?
Well, they usually go through various larval stages that change quite a bit. If you remember the diagram of the barnacles, they have the Nauplius larvae, and then they have another larval stage. And sometimes there's 3, 4, 6 different larval stages before they reach a form that sort of looks like the adult. But some of them will go through all these larval stages within the egg, and then some of the crustaceans eliminate some of the larval stages and have other larval stages that like a zoa larva that's for the decapod crustaceans. That's common, as the Nauplius larvae is not common and often omitted. So it depends on the crustacean group. But some of them, it's just they hatch from the egg and look like a miniature adult, and others, it's the life cycle is far more complex. Depends on the species.
You commented on eating crab legs. My knowledge of eating crabs is from blue crabs in the eastern US, where sawshell crabs, you're eating the entire crab. Is that the only species for which we do that?
Oh, it's not the only species. In general, most of what you find in a supermarket are crab legs. But yeah, there are some crabs where you eat the whole thing. Other people say guts and all. No. So it depends. Like a lot of things, they're food preferences in different cultures. And with crabs, again, most of the time when we're eating what we like eating meat, which is muscle tissue, and the muscle tissue inside the crab body is quite sparse. It's all in the legs. But if there's other things that are edible, just like some people will eat liver, heart, whatever, intestines from a mammal or a bird, while other people say that's disgusting. So cultural differences, species differences, and depends on how you cook it. If you boil everything together in a soup, you can eat all kinds of things that you normally would maybe turn your nose up at.
I'm going to read one from the chat from George Y. Do you know if the crayfish found in McGregor and Travers reservoirs are introduced or from the British Battle River population?
Are those in the Bow system? I don't know where those are, but all I've read is that the only crustaceans that are native to Alberta were in the Beaver system, which is to the east and a little bit south of where we are in Athabasca, so north of the Saskatchewan system. And so probably if they're in, say, the Bow or the South Saskatchewan or North Saskatchewan, they've been introduced. And I don't know anybody who's been studying these introductions, but if you look at any animal group, there's lots of introductions that haven't been properly documented in where they are and when they were first discovered.
George said yes, it's in the Bow system.
Okay, so yeah, I would think that, and I don't know what species that might be the native species, and it may be something that somebody introduced from the pet trade. And that's one of the problems with the pet trade is release of animals. They feel that it's, they don't want to kill their pet that they're bored of, or it's gotten too big for them. And this has caused no end of ecological problems, especially in warm places like Florida, where they have the pythons released into the Everglades and other places that have all kinds of problems from introduced, and those were all from the pet trade. So I don't know, but it would be nice. This is where citizen science could come into play, is if somebody could coordinate it, is to collect some specimens, crayfish from various locations in the province, get them to an expert. And I'm not an expert, but there might be somebody who would learn to be an expert, could even be a normal citizen, and find out where they all are and whether they're the same species or not. But again, a lot of our of these introductions are not documented, and I think they should be, because there are things we're worried about of diseases and other things that they could be introducing that are not normally present and cause havoc with what we really like, our fish. And so I don't know.
Robert, we have several questions in the chat. A couple from Haleen. Are there any edible crustacean parasites?
Oh, I don't know of any, but I wouldn't be surprised that somewhere, some group of people like some particular thing that use it as a delicacy that they eat, but I don't know of any.
Okay, and another question from Haleen. How did they evolve? I heard somewhere that a lot of things evolved to be crab-like with no relation to actual crabs.
Well, that's a very complex question, but in evolution, the parasites tend to lose the distinguishing features of the group that they've evolved from over time, because they lose their digestive system, they lose their system for sensory organs that a normal animal might have, and they become very simplified, at least towards the final stage. Like the barnacle one, it has some stages at the beginning of its lifespan that look remarkably like other crustaceans, and that's why they were originally found to be crustaceans. But parasites are very interesting organisms. The book that I got the pictures from, the isopod that chews out the tongue of the fish, is called Parasite Rex. Being Parasite King, Rex is king. So if you look up that book, Parasite Rex, it's available on the internet, maybe from your local library. It's a very interesting read about parasites and some of their adaptations and some of their evolution. But yeah, the evolutionary history of parasites is very complex. I'm always amazed at how they can pass from one generation to the next, and they have these various mechanisms for modifying the behavior of their hosts, and how they do that, we really don't know, but they've got to be doing it with brain chemistry, and it's very interesting, but I'm at a loss. Sorry.
I'm going to read one from Marshall, who is 11 years old. I read that lobsters can live a very long time, up to 80 years. Is that true? How long do crabs live?
Yeah, I think the record is probably for lobsters is in that neighborhood. They found out with lobsters that their chromosomes don't tend to deteriorate as our chromosomes do. There's things called telomeres that we lose, and then our cells don't reproduce properly, and we age and die. Well, lobsters don't tend to do that, so they continue to live for a long period of time. And we don't really know the record of them, because we, up until recently, haven't had a mechanism for figuring out their age. But I read somewhere that there's some I can't remember what it is, the statocyst or there's some structure in a lobster that has rings of growth. And maybe in the future, people will be able to count these rings and figure out the ages of them. But yeah, they live a long period of time, and as they get bigger, as they get older, they get bigger. And that's where these large lobster come from. Well, most lobsters are, they're half a kilogram or a kilogram at most that we eat, and these really big ones are rare. Now, I missed the second half of the question. What was that, Carmen?
I think you covered just how long.
Oh,
how long do
okay.
they live?
And for crabs, I don't know, but I imagine that crabs, some of them, like that big crab, that Japanese spider crab, that was shown in the picture, I imagine that one was many years old. And crabs probably have the same thing as they continue to grow and grow older and grow bigger. But I don't know the age for crabs. And again, there's lots of different crabs. Some crabs have a life history of 1 year, and others are many years.
So there are more questions in the chat that I'll get to. I just wanted to also say if anyone wants to ask a question live, then you can unmute and ask that. Okay, I don't hear anyone jumping in. A question from Schofield, from the Schofield household. Do some of the larger crustaceans have capacity for intelligence?
They can, some crustaceans have the ability to do some simple learning, but not very much. An octopus or a squid would outmaneuver them hands down. If octopus and squid didn't have such short lifespans, they would probably dominate the oceans because they're so intelligent. But most of them live less than 3 years, and so can't pass on the knowledge that they have. So the crustaceans are not very bright and can't do much learning. They have some, but very limited capacity. Most of their activities are done by what we call instinct.
Okay, a comment from Allison who says, wow, very interesting. Thank you. Even had a few laughs. Can't wait for spring so I can go see what I can identify in my pond at the back of my property.
Well, that's good. I mean, I hope that this talk will encourage some people to go out to the ponds around where they live in the spring, especially, and look for things. Those tadpole shrimp, I didn't say it, but I might have indicated on the slides, are our second largest crustacean, and they can also be found in the pet trade. You can buy them as eggs and hatch them out at home, but it would be neat to find them in the wild, and they are a couple of centimeters long and quite prehistoric looking. They're neat. And the fairy shrimp you can keep in a container and watch them, and you can feed them with small bits of even fish food or algae that you collect at the pond. But yeah, please, I think I would encourage families to go out in the spring with a little net or a jar and some big boots. Don't go over and get wet, but I'm sure you could find some interesting things, crustaceans as well as other things.
Okay, Jack says, why haven't sowbugs been formally described in Alberta when they seem to be so prevalent?
Because nobody has been interested enough to document them. And another citizen science project, as I say, I was quite surprised to find that they hadn't been documented. I grew up in Saskatchewan. I know there's sowbugs there. I found sowbugs in Alberta, but I never paid attention to them. And I always expected somebody else would be interested and would document them, but doesn't seem that it's been done. And so the taxonomy has been worked out. It's not that there's a great deal of difficulty, because they're European species, and the Europeans have documented far more than what we have done in North America. And it's just a matter of interest. We've got lots of bird watchers, but very few sowbug watchers. But we could have a half a dozen sowbug watchers that could contribute knowledge about the location of sowbugs in Alberta and the species that occur. And I wouldn't be surprised that some of the sowbugs we have here, the life history hasn't been documented. I know I did watch a YouTube video where this guy was raising about, well, what he had, about 10, 12 different species of sowbugs. And some people raise sowbugs as pets and they enjoy them. I never thought that that was possible, but it was. And he keeps them, he feeds them also to his, I think he had some reptiles that he was feeding his sowbugs to. But yeah, sowbugs are quite interesting, and because they are terrestrial, they're easier, I think, to raise than a lot of crustaceans, and easy to observe. But yeah, we need some documentation, and I don't know of anyone who's taken the interest. But maybe we could have a sowbug group form somewhere. There is the group of Alberta Bugs, which is a list server that one can get onto and can talk to people who are interested. I know there's been John Acorn set up a thing that he does each winter on what arthropods he find that people find that are alive and moving around in the winter time. And the list includes sowbugs, and some people have photographed them, but we don't have good identifications. The best identification I found was from a visiting scientist from China, who identified, tentatively identified one species from Edmonton. But as I say, Montana's got 4 species, so I imagine we don't have a huge number, but I imagine we have at least 2 or 3 species across the province, and it would be good to document them. But so far, it hasn't been done.
Wayne has a couple comments. He said originally, kraken were considered to be similar to giant crustaceans or colossal whales. And then he also says nobody outsmarts the kraken.
Yeah. Well, now kraken is supposedly a big squid or a big octopus, but yes, kraken are mythological beings that and the colossal squid and giant squids are very big animals, and but not as big as the ones that are depicted in the horror stories of the sailing vessels that came about.
Okay, I don't think I see any questions in the chat. Does anyone have just some comments? Does anyone have any questions they want to ask? No?
Well,
okay.
Thank you very much for
I have one question. If someone,
There's one question I
sorry.
hear.
Robert, it's Doug.
Oh, hi.
What I'm wondering about is there's all kinds of names that you were mentioning, both scientific and whatever, and scientific and common names. Do you have any? Can you give us any ideas about where the names came from, or is there etymology on some of the names?
Yeah, well, I did do some of the things that all the pod stuff is dealing with. Pod or ped is Greek for foot, and a lot of the names of crustaceans are from Greek or from Latin or origins, and but common names arise left, right, and center depending on the ethnicity of the inhabitants. If they came from a certain place in Europe that had a name for a similar looking animal, that name gets put onto the thing and it might spread. But this presentation, hopefully, if everything works, will be available on YouTube. And if you want to go and look at the various technical names, and you go to a place like Wikipedia, Wikipedia will then usually list the derivation from the original Greek or the original Latin or whatever, and talk about the derivation. So most of these names mean something, but some of them, it's not clear where the name came from. And some of them are the derivation is so old that it's been lost. But yeah, those technical names, in biology, we tend to have hierarchies, which, for example, if you talk about a vehicle, and a vehicle could include ships and boats and cars and planes and all kinds of things. And of the cars, they can talk about internal combustion versus steam driven, and in your hierarchy, and it goes on forever. And so in biology, all of these things are in various hierarchies, and the hierarchies though show relationships. And I put in the technical names so that if people wanted to delve further into a certain group, they could easily get into it. If you use a common name, sometimes you get misled and you get into, like if you just put in mantis, you're going to get an insect. But if you put in Mantis Shrimp, you'll usually get the right place. But if you put in mud bug, I don't know whether you'll get a connection or not. So the scientific names, why I like them is because they mean the same in English, French, Russian, Chinese, or whatever. They mean the same thing, and that's universal. But common names, we forget that for every English common name, there's a French one, there's a Spanish one, there's a Greek one, there's a Italian one, there's a Swahili one. So that's why I like the scientific names, because then you're talking about the same critter.
All right, any last questions for Dr. Holmberg?
Well, again, thank you very much. And this presentation hopefully will be recorded and available if you wanted to look at it or you wanted to recommend it to one of your friends. And so good night. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Linda, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending. And our next talk is March 23rd, Reality of Fake Science. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Bye then.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, so how do I turn this off?
Robert, stunning performance, and I'll try to catch some more of these lectures, but you